Hello, welcome. Thank you very much for coming to our Search and Matching in Macro and Finance seminar. We're super excited to have Andrea Eisfeldt as our speaker today from UCLA. She's going to be presenting her paper in OTC Intermediaries. Several of her co-authors are actually in this session and will be able to answer your question in the Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, ask them right away. Don't hold back. We'll also be having a Q&A after the seminar. Where we'll be taking some longer questions, where you can ask your questions and Andrea will be answering them, or her co-authors will. We have a selection of panelists here that will be able to engage in discussion during the seminar, but everybody, we're asking you please to participate. Whenever you have a good question, ask it in the Q&A and we'll either answer it there or call on you to answer it live. All right, so we would like to tell you that all seminars will be recorded, including this one. It will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. And of course, we'll be moderating to make sure that we're not going to have any offensive questions or other problems like this. So I'm not going to read out the list of panels because it's very long. So the only other thing I would like to mention to you is our upcoming workshops right at the top. We're having a workshop on advances in search theory on October 2. And a workshop on the economics of digital currencies on October 7 through 9. And obviously, we're very excited to have those two. And then our next speaker will be Benjamin Lester from the Philly Fed in 2 weeks. All right, and I've really said too much now. Let me unshare my screen here, and then it'll be Andrea's turn. Andrea, please share your screen now.
Okay, I'm guessing everybody can see the screen now.
Looks great.
Okay.
Actually, now it doesn't look great anymore. What changed?
I don't know.
Oh, now it looks good again.
Okay, and what about if I do this?
No.
Okay. All right. Wait, am I, oh, sorry, hold on. It should be, is this changing the slide? Yeah. Okay, that's fine. It's on my iPad, but somehow the placement on my desktop is affecting it. Is it still good now?
This looks great.
Okay, thanks so much for having me. This is such an excellent venue for us to be able to present this work. So thanks everyone for coming. This is joint work with Bernard Herskovic, Sriram Rajan, and Emil Siriwardane. And actually, Bernard just had a baby last week. Emil is teaching, and Sriram might be in the audience. So I'll do my best to answer questions live. So, you know, please feel free to speak up. So I'll start with a little bit of motivation. I don't think I have to convince anyone in this audience that many important asset classes trade over the counter. There has been this really exciting new work recently, I think forthcoming in one of the top 3 finance journals by Haddad and Muir, where they show that more intermediated assets are more sensitive to the intermediary factor. And we're going to interpret this actually as OTC assets are more sensitive to the intermediary factor. And their ranking of least to most sensitive to the intermediary asset pricing factor is stocks, bonds, options, sovereign bonds, commodities, foreign exchange, MBS, and CDS. And we're actually going to be studying their most intermediated asset class when we look at, when we apply the model to a specific market, which is CDS. There's also evidence that the financial health of particular dealers matters for asset pricing. So in Emil's job market paper, he shows that the return on a dealer's CDS portfolio, so the actual risk-bearing capacity of the desk that's affected by the performance of its CDS portfolio, affects pricing of that desk's CDS offerings. And then there's a very new, nice, also forthcoming paper by Lewis Longstaff and Petrosek, where they look at asset mispricing. That's the title of the paper. They're looking at FDIC bonds issued by FDIC insured dealers that have no credit risk during a special program of the Fed. And they show that dealers' positions in particular issuers' bonds affect the pricing of those bonds. So there are certain dealers that actually play a larger role in certain reference entities, and those dealers' inventories in those bonds affect bond pricing. And they have this nice quote that actually was suggested by one of their referees, saying this task is made somewhat challenging by the fact that a number of the theoretical models, and actually, you know, in conversations with Francis, I think most of the models, if not all of the models, are developed in settings with only one asset and or a single representative intermediary. And so one of the things that we're going to be focused on is the fact that not all intermediaries play the same role. Some provide risk-bearing capacity, some demand risk-bearing capacity, some are mainly, you know, kind of true intermediaries where they're kind of neutral in terms of their net position. So here's just another kind of quick motivation, which is to show CDS prices during the financial crisis and you know, kind of argue that they react to single dealer events. So this first dot is when Bank of America purchases Countrywide. Countrywide's got a, you know, huge mortgage portfolio. People are worried about that. Bank of America is a key dealer. CDS prices go up. When JP Morgan is approved for buying Bear Stearns, CDS prices go down, risk-bearing capacity goes up. Lehman files for bankruptcy, risk-bearing capacity goes down, CDS prices go up, and then finally when the Fed and Treasury announce a restructuring plan, we see CDS prices normalizing. So this is just to say that we don't have really a representative intermediary, and the way we do the weighting of equity weighting, when we construct the intermediary asset pricing factor empirically, we don't know if that's actually the correct weighting if dealers are actually heterogeneous. So we're going to study CDS pricing in a tractable model that's easy to calibrate, and that's going to be kind of one of the main advantages of the framework we're looking at. And then we're going to connect these literatures on OTC markets for financial assets, with which many of you have worked on, intermediary asset pricing, and systemic risk. Sort of by showing that prices are going to depend on network frictions. This is, you know, illuminating some of the effects of network pricing and OTC pricing that some of you all have contributed. Dealer risk-bearing capacity. So just like in the intermediary asset pricing literature, it's really going to be the risk-bearing capacity of the dealer sector that's going to matter for asset prices. And the removal of a single dealer will affect prices. So that's how we're going to connect to the systemic risk literature. And I should say that this is only a first step because we have a static model. So our model is really to highlight in a quantitative way the impact of network frictions, dealer heterogeneity, and the importance of the dealer sector risk-bearing capacity on asset prices. And by the way, to the organizers, I actually can't see the chat right now, so feel free, you know, everyone, you know, feel free to interrupt me if anyone wants to ask a question. Okay, so CDS prices or spreads, the price of aggregate credit risk are going to depend on network frictions because of limited connectivity. Our baseline model is core periphery. We can also we can solve that model analytically. We have a direct mapping between parameters and prices and allocations in that version of the model. We can solve any, you know, sort of general network, and we do solve models with the empirical network numerically. So we have limited connectivity. Not all participants in the network are connected to each other. We also have aversion to large bilateral exposures. And what that's going to mean is when a particular counterparty or institution looks out and wants to adjust their exposure to credit risk through the OTC network, they're going to want to diversify their position across as many intermediaries as possible and sort of equalize their trade across their available counterparties. And in practice, there are many reasons to do this. When I was chief economist at an MBS hedge fund, we found that it was very important to diversify our repo financing across dealers because during the financial crisis, we had experienced holdup problems. And we also felt that it was important just from a diversification, sort of a risk management perspective. There may also be concerns about information leakage, so many reasons, and developing multiple relationships. So many reasons why you would want to spread your trades across counterparties. In our model, with those two frictions, limited connectivity and aversion to large bilateral exposures, is going to give us imperfect risk sharing and price dispersion. So it turns out that if you have limited connectivity, but you can trade an unlimited amount with any one counterparty at no cost, then you actually go back to sort of a perfect risk sharing environment. And same thing if you, yes, go ahead.
Are you treating the aversion to large bilateral exposures as a primitive assumption, or that's a result?
It's a primitive assumption.
Okay. I mean, you could get it as a result probably, but just to clarify.
We have a way in the appendix, and that's true. And we're kind of building on the existing literature to, to build that into the model. And actually in the paper, the Econometrica paper with Andy and Pierre, we had something similar in that we had line limits. So each trader could only trade up to a line limit K with their particular counterparty. So that's sort of an extreme version of this convex cost that we're going to have. In the appendix, we have a micro foundation, which is sort of like, every time you trade with someone, there's also, in addition to the payoff of the contract, there's some idiosyncratic cost or benefit that comes from that trading with that counterparty per unit that you trade with them. And that kind of gives you idiosyncratic risk per trading partner and makes you want to diversify across counterparties. But there are other interesting ways of
Sure. So in the model, it is a convex cost, or?
Yeah. We'll get there. Sorry.
Yeah.
Kind of previewing too much, but thanks a lot for the question. Yeah. So the advantage of the way we're doing that is just this direct mapping between parameters and outcomes. So we get this very sort of simple intuition from the model with this. So dealer sector risk-bearing capacity, just like in the intermediary models, the price level, so the OTC price versus the Walrasian or complete network price, is going to depend on the net position of the dealer sector mainly. And that is because of the number of connections that they have and their importance in pricing in this model. And it's going to turn out that you can get any ordering. So most of the time in normal times, dealer trades are going to occur at lower spreads than customer dealer spreads. And that actually is going to be lower than the the Walrasian spread. But you can get other orderings depending on what's going on with the health of the dealer sector. So that's going to be something we talk about near the end. And then connecting again to systemic risk literature, we're going to see what happens when we remove a single dealer. Now, there are kind of two differences with the standard OTC intermediary framework. There's kind of the drawback of what we're doing, which is it's static. That's a key drawback that we're working to address in ongoing work. But there are two other differences. One is the countable number of dealers. So if you don't have a continuum, you can have single dealer leaving the market, leading to sort of an actual discontinuous jump in the SDF. And then you have heterogeneous risk-bearing capacities, which really seems consistent with the data, not only that we're looking at, but the Siriwardane paper and the Lewis Longstaff Petrusik paper. The punchline of that dealer removal exercise is going to be that removing the largest net seller of credit protection increases spreads by 20% in the baseline calibration. And that's a big number, so we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Please do.
In the second bullet point, you mentioned the asset price depends on the next net position of the dealer sector. My question is, does it also depend on the bilateral exposures?
Yes, yes, in the sense that, literally prices will be a function of their net exposures to credit. So they're going to start with some underlying position, say their bond portfolio, their loan portfolio, they're going to trade to try to share risk in the CDS market. The total net exposure from the pre-trade exposure plus the trade in the CDS market is literally going to determine the risk-bearing capacity of the dealer sector. But of course, those allocations are going to depend on the trading frictions. Does that help for now? And then we'll look at the model.
Maybe I'll wait for the model.
Yeah. Okay, so it's coming up starting on the next slide. So we'll do the overview of the structural model first. Then we'll talk about some facts of the CDS market via the proprietary DTCC data that we're accessing through the Office of Financial Research, which I should say, the views expressed in this paper are not the views of the OFR or anyone, really, but the authors and me. And then we'll look at the estimation and counterfactuals. So the network effect on the level of credit prices, the network effect on the dispersion in prices, in particular, the difference between dealer prices and customer prices. And here's Bernard, congratulations on his new arrival, and thank you for coming. He looks only slightly sleep deprived. And then we'll look at the effective dealer failure. So let's talk about the model then. Okay, so we're going to have N agents. Each is going to be endowed with omega I units of a corporate bond. So that's their underlying exposure to credit risk. We do have a version of the model in a revision that's nearing completion, where we have heterogeneity and risk aversion instead of initial endowments. But our main motivation for trade is risk sharing, which is going to be driven by heterogeneity and initial exposures to the aggregate credit risk factor. We do also have a version in the appendix with speculative trading motives. The main intuition is really the same in all three of these versions. So we're going to focus on this version in the talk, with the heterogeneity being driven by heterogeneous initial exposures to an aggregate credit risk factor. So you can think of those omega I's as units of a corporate bond. Those bonds are going to pay off 1 minus D, where the expected default is mu, and the variance of that default amount is sigma squared. So we're going to allow these agents, after their initial endowment of credit risk, to trade in a CDS market. When a trader I sells CDS to J, I pays D tomorrow and gets that CDS spread Rij that is specific to the two counterparties today. There is going to be a network of exogenous trading connections, G, which is going to be N by N, and we're going to match that to the data. Our baseline calibration and model intuition is going to come from a core periphery case. We're going to show, as others have shown, that this very closely matches the data, but we can actually, numerically use the actual empirical trading matrix. But we're going to use a dealer selection algorithm that minimizes the distance between the model's G core periphery, conditional on being core periphery, and the actual empirical trading network. Agents are going to choose CDS trades with connected counterparties, taking bilateral prices as given. And Gij is just going to be that each entry 0 or 1 in the connection matrix G. Okay, so this
sorry, can I actually?
Yeah, please.
Is it D aggregate, or it's idiosyncratic that's different across different agent or bonds, or?
It's aggregate. So we're gonna be using all, when we look at prices, when we look at spreads, we are gonna use all single name transactions in the CDS market. So this is sort of a detail of the CDS market. Our data is gonna be from like 2011 to 2013. So you want to think of normal times, and you also want to think of a time when there is very little central clearing of single name contracts in CDS, but there is clearing of index contracts. So when we look at positions, we're going to use all single name contracts and all index contracts, and sort of aggregate the exposure to the aggregate credit risk factor using either DV01 weightings or beta weightings, but literally we're going to be measuring exposure to the aggregate credit risk factor. And when we do our pricing, it is going to be the pricing of aggregate credit risk, but it is going to be, you know, it is a model of a single asset, and we have to aggregate the data up to sort of, you know, exposure to the aggregate factor to be able to map the data into the model. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay,
And
cool.
one quick question.
Yes. Yeah.
So you have a finite number of dealers, but they don't take into account any pricing. They don't have any price impact on what you're going to do, right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. That's right. And we do have a version with price impact in the appendix as well. So we can show that our main results are going to go through there, but in the calibrated version, we have 14 dealers via the dealer selection algorithm, the minimum distance algorithm we use. There are 20 banks that are labeled as DTCC dealers by the DTCC. And, you know, I think that there's super interesting work on price impact. We can incorporate that in the baseline calibration. The intuition is the same. I think the magnitudes, you know, will change a bit. So, you know, we could run some of those quantitative exercises too, which I think would be interesting. Yeah.
It would also affect the impact, right? The heterogeneity would also be affected by that, I think. You will have the heterogeneous price impacts, right? It would exacerbate the heterogeneity you have that's based on the risk sharing motives.
Right. So in the dealer removal exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, you know, part of the issue is, and I think it would be an extension, because I feel we have a lot of results in the paper as it is, but I agree with you that it would impact the effect of a single dealer removal. In some sense, exacerbating it might not help us, because people seem to think that the effects are large. So we're actually looking into, ways that, things that might make it a little bit smaller. But I will say this as well, I think it's possible that this detailed data may allow us to, look into that. And I think that's, the key thing right now is that we have this direct mapping between the parameters and the data. But we do have, trade by trade data. So we may be able to get at those price impact parameters that are in the version, in the appendix. And that would be, I think, a fascinating extension. So thanks. And I'm guessing this is recorded, but if there are questions in the chat, hopefully we'll get those after too. So we'll definitely be thinking about those. Thank you. Okay, so you guys are probably familiar with, what a core periphery network looks like, but this is sort of in this example, this is the dealer sector. They're connected to everyone. That corresponds to, they're fully connected to each other. And then they're also fully connected to the whole customer sector. These 4 customers down here, they're kind of connected to themselves, and then they're connected to the entire dealer sector, but not to each other. So that's going to be the core periphery case. Okay, so here's each trader or each institution's objective functions. They have mean variance preferences. They're going to choose their bilateral trades in order to maximize the value of their initial exposures, which is their bond portfolio, which is going to pay an expected value 1 minus mu, which is the average default rate. Then on all the trades that they enter into, the gamma IJ, when gamma is positive, they are increasing their exposure to the aggregate credit risk factor. They collect the CDS spread that's specific to the 2 counterparties to the trade RIJ, and then they're going to be paying an expected value, that expected default rate. They are risk averse, and so this, this term here is just going to make them not want to take on too much exposure to the aggregate credit risk factor because of the default risk. That is going to be subject to the 2 constraints that just define the exposure that you pick up to the aggregate credit risk factor in the CDS trading market, and that you can't trade with people if you're not connected to them. So ZI is going to be a trader I's overall net position in the CDS market, and then their total exposure to the aggregate credit risk factor will be omega I, their initial endowment, plus that ZI. So the sort of the novel part to this objective function, but something that is capturing, you know, potential effects of price impact, risk management, avoiding holdup problems, building relationships, limiting the release of information, is this fee parameter, which you can see is multiplying the square of the total trade that you do with counterparty J. So again, you want to picture a particular institution. If they are endowed with a very large corporate bond portfolio or loan portfolio, they want to unload some of that credit risk through their available counterparties. When they look out, they're going to see price dispersion. The people that were endowed initially with you know, no credit risk exposure or negative credit risk exposure, which in our model we normalize it at 0, so low credit risk exposure, they're going to be offering the best prices. But when I decide who I'm going to trade with, I'm going to be trading off the better prices from the people who have sort of more risk-bearing capacity, with the fact that I don't want to generate a very large bilateral position with that counterparty. And that fee times gamma squared is capturing that aversion to large bilateral positions. Okay, there were some questions about that. So do you guys, anyone want to ask some questions there?
Yep, maybe it's also clarification on Cecilia's question. So Cecilia, your question was that fees with price impact would be endogenous to the network structure, or and that we would expect it to change, say, when a dealer is removed?
That was
Yeah, Cecilia, go ahead.
Yeah. I think that
same question, or
it was just that.
Yeah, and I think and that's true. So we're gonna, you know, we're gonna have the sort of macro calibrated version of that. We're gonna allow fee to change when we remove a dealer, but we do not have, you know, when a dealer is removed, there's an endogenous change in fee.
But but the estimation will tell you whether or not fee looks very stable or not, and I mean, perhaps the estimation.
Yeah, so that's an interesting. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, yeah, we haven't done that, but it's a great idea. So, what we do is we estimate fee in normal times, and then we see what the effect on prices is of removing a dealer. The other thing we could do, unfortunately, we don't have the, you know, financial crisis in our data. And I don't think we have access over this period, which is sort of normal times. But you could think about doing the reverse. We know kind of the at least the change in prices. I think we need price dispersion. Well, we do need price dispersion too. So there are some parameters we'd have a hard time calibrating, but we can think about doing the reverse exercise, which is take the change in prices as given and see what the change in fee would have to be. Yeah, we could do that. Yeah.
Andrea, so this essentially implies that having exposure to a core dealer or to a periphery dealer, it maps exactly in the same way.
Yeah, and we don't have periphery dealers. I'm sorry, is this Celia again?
The guys at the bottom.
Oh,
not the periphery dealers. You say core periphery, so you have this matrix.
But I just call them periphery institutions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they will this gamma ij would include exposure to the periphery institutions.
Yes, and so we have a version in the appendix as well with heterogeneous fees, meaning that you have a different fee. You know, usually when and we've done several exercises with heterogeneous fees. So meaning, you know, I think about having a large bilateral exposure with, you know, a dealer different than a customer. And I think of it differently also if I'm the seller of protection versus if I'm the one that's buying protection. So the easiest case is where we set the fee when you're selling protection to zero. So it's like, I'll sell you as much protection as you want. I'm saying it's easiest because it just gives us the fewest free parameters that we need to pin down in the data. And then, you know, the fee that you have when you buy from someone depends on if that person or that institution is a dealer or a customer. And, you know, all the intuition is similar. The quantitative effects can be different. We haven't found very large differences, but we're kind of still exploring the heterogeneous fee and in particular how it affects that change in spreads upon dealer removal. So let's call that a work in progress that we can handle, but I'm not going to have quantitative results today.
So can I ask a question? So this mu is about the default of some external institutions, right? It's not the institutions in the network.
No, yeah, think of mu as literally like and I'll show you a picture, it's the aggregate credit risk factor. So it's, okay. You know, so think about an investment grade CDS index because, you know, because our pricing is coming from single names, you know, those are traded on larger reference entities. Yeah.
Can the institutions on the network default?
No, we can remove them, but we don't have an entry decision. So again, another interesting extension would be to have sort of a participation cost and then have them think about whether they want, you know, you know, that participation cost is set so that these guys all want to participate, you know, in the initial stage. And then you could think about, you know, something happens with the aggregate credit risk factor and they might think about not participating after that. But that would be another fairly large extension of what we have here. Okay.
So I have a question. So the gammas here, basically an agent gets penalized for having different gammas with different agents. Is it going to be symmetric? Do you think it's going to be symmetric when a dealer is buying CDS protection versus selling CDS protection? Because you know, when you're buying CDS protection, yes, you're concerned about your counterparty risk, etc. But when you're selling, maybe you don't really worry about counterparty risk.
That's right. Sorry, I just answered that question.
Okay.
And we do have a version of the model where this fee is 0 when you're selling protection, and it's positive when you're buying protection, and depends on whether your counterparty is a dealer or customer. But that's not the version I'm going to present today. But I agree with you. I think there are heterogeneous fees. It's just going to be, you know, we're going to have some very clean intuition, and it's interesting. You know, I'm not going to have time to talk about the heterogeneous fee case, but I think the general results are kind of very similar. It's just a matter of, again, this 20% increase in spreads. You know, that's when the fee is calibrated to be the same for everyone. If we actually give you know, customers a lower fee for trading with dealers, the increase in spreads, you know, can go up because it's really the dealer sector risk bearing capacity that's affected. So if we allow customers to sort of you know, provide some of that risk bearing capacity, then the spreads, you know, might be a little lower, and that's something that we're looking into for sure. Yeah, so I'm going to move on because, you know, we're not going to unfortunately have time to talk about those extensions today. I'll give you the main intuition, and then I'll point you to the paper for the heterogeneous fee cases. And actually, you know, we have one version in the paper, and now we have a couple more that we're developing and we'll put in. Okay, so no transactions costs is just going to mean that the spread that I collect is equal to the spread that I'm getting paid, and then the market clearing conditions are that the gammas sum to 0. And by the way, thank you very much for all the questions, because we're undergoing a very large revision, and so we're trying to figure out what's going to go into the main paper and the online appendix. So it's really crucial for us to understand what people are most interested in seeing. So I'm going to give you some equilibrium intuition, which is kind of come from first order conditions. So as is usual, we're going to have a marginal benefit of selling CDS on the left-hand side. I collect spreads, but I'm going to have to pay the expected default amount. I'm gonna exploit price dispersion across counterparties up to this aversion, the marginal cost of being averse to having a very large bilateral exposure to a particular counterparty J, that's this first term. And I'm also gonna, you know, I'm gonna attenuate my accumulation of credit risk in the CDS market because I'm just risk averse, and this term captures the marginal cost of risk exposure to that aggregate credit risk factor. Okay, and then these prices are going to be equal to the average shadow prices of risk. So this is the fundamental credit risk times risk aversion. And this is the average post-trade exposure of the two counterparties. Here's sort of the contract premium, the spread on the trade over and above the expected default. And note that fee is not showing up here on the right-hand side, but of course it is showing up on the left-hand side, as you can see from the first order condition. So again, when I look out, I want to exploit price dispersion. I want to buy low and sell high, but I'm only going to do that to the extent that that's not forcing me to accumulate very large bilateral positions with my counterparties. Okay, and also, by the way, now that Bernard is here, you can feel free to ask him really tough questions in the chat and make sure that he's, you know, got enough sleep after his 1 week old, less than 1 week old, I guess. Okay, so let's see. So last thing then is that in terms of quantities, the post-trade exposures rely on all path connected agents. So you see this kind of this network thing that I always think is very much like a VAR, where your exposures kind of depends in an exponentially decaying way on the exposures of all your connected counterparties. Again, this is just a reminder of what our theoretical G matrix looks like. I'll show you an empirical version of the G matrix, the actual G matrix, when we get to the data. So now let me review, or let me present, the key equilibrium properties of the core periphery case, which is going to be that case where we have this really simple two equation mapping between simple empirical moments that we observe and the key parameters in the model, the risk aversion parameter and the aversion to large bilateral positions phi. We have this closed form mapping from empirical moments to structural parameters. The network frictions are going to deliver price dispersion, and the dealer risk-bearing capacity is going to determine the price level relative to the Walrasian or complete network. So we have this OTC intermediary asset pricing in the sense that it's the dealer risk-bearing capacity that determines the price level. If the core is small, so it doesn't have to be super small, but in most empirical networks will definitely satisfy that. I think we have like 700 institutions in this market, and 14 or 20 of them are dealers. In sort of normal times, when dealer risk-bearing capacity is greater than that of customers, and that's the sort of standard intermediary asset pricing case, then we have that the initial exposure of the dealers from their bond or loan portfolio is lower than the economy-wide average, and the dealer spread, the average of those spreads, is lower than the customer dealer spreads, which is again lower than the complete network spread. So OTC prices are lower than Walrasian prices, and dealer trades occur at lower spreads than customer dealer trades. Now, you know, it's sort of like when I think about the asset pricing, and there's a credit spread puzzle, and spreads are actually higher than we think they should be due to fundamental credit risk, and you know, people then add countercyclical default, pro-cyclical recovery rates, higher risk aversion in bad times to explain the level of credit spread. So the fact that the OTC network is giving us lower spreads than Walrasian, sort of going against that. What is the intuition, and how can this still be a good way of thinking about asset pricing? And I should say this fact is, you know, for sure in other papers, it's definitely in the Javazza airplane dealer market, the basic driver of this is just the worse risk sharing due to the network friction. So it's not that, you know, this is great, we're able to trade credit risk at lower prices. No, these lower prices are reflecting the fact that the dealer sector has this higher risk bearing capacity, lower initial exposures, and we're not able to fully exploit that because of the incomplete network and the aversion to large bilateral positions.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So is the, in your setting, the dealers are fully connected, and the network friction comes from the fact that customers can only trade with dealer but not with each other?
It comes from two things. It comes from that fact and the fact that you're averse to large bilateral positions.
And that also, but the counterfactual, the complete network is a network where everybody can trade with everybody. Right?
Everybody can trade with everybody, or fee is zero.
Fee is zero. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. Okay. So, but why would this be potentially a useful framework then for thinking about asset pricing at all? Well, it turns out that that ranking that we see during normal times isn't the only ranking we can see. When customer risk-bearing capacity actually exceeds that of dealers, which can happen if a big net seller of credit protection exits the market, then we can have that without that key dealer, the exposure pre-trade of dealers is actually higher than that of customers. And then we have this ranking where the dealer-dealer trades occur at higher spreads than dealer-customer trades, because now the customer sector is providing insurance to the dealer sector, and those prices are all going to be above the complete network price. So if it is in bad times when a dealer exits, that is the time where you will see the dealer sector risk-bearing capacity lower than that of customer sector. Picture big hedge funds that will try to step in. They're not as effective at doing that because they're not as connected. So you get this fact that in bad times, the spreads actually widen more. So you have this, as you do with these other mechanisms of worse things happening in credit markets in bad times, you have a force that can generate higher spreads on average, even if on average the spreads are lower than the Walrasian spread. Okay, so yep, that's just to say that empirically in normal times, dealers are net sellers. So as in intermediary asset pricing, the dealer sector is the one that's providing insurance to the market. They have a lower ex-ante exposure to credit risk. That's what we infer from their trades in the CDS market, and heterogeneity and risk aversion, or alpha, is going to yield similar results. I'm going to skip these comparative statics, I think, in the interest of time. And I just want to comment, because we just had this question, completing the network is effectively the same as setting fee to zero. So if I allow you to accumulate trades of any size with any person that you choose, you will fully exploit price dispersion, and that is going to be perfect risk sharing. The average price in that, I'm sorry, it's not perfect risk sharing, but the average price will coincide perfectly with the competitive price. Okay. Let me go to the data now, because I want to get to the quantitative exercise. And we're going to use this data from the DTCC. It's trade by trade data where we observe counterparties and prices. We're looking at the entire CDS market for all US firms. So there's just this slight difference between the Fed version of the data and the OFR version of the data, which is that we see all US reference entities. They don't have to be Fed regulated, which means we do see the large hedge funds, and there are some large customer, meaning not fully connected and not very well connected, that are probably, you know, large hedge funds. Beginning in January 2010, updated every Friday through 2013. So you want to think of us observing this market during normal times. We have very detailed information: swap type, trader identities, notional amount, pricing, flows, and positions. So we don't just see the trades, we accumulate the positions into stocks of exposures. We focus on these non-cleared single name transactions, but then we aggregate up to exposure to the aggregate credit risk factor. Okay, so we're reviewing again the G matrix, just to, you know, kind of refresh your thoughts. And then this is the empirical G matrix. Everybody's connected to themselves. That's the sort of thick or one cell thick diagonal line. And then these guys here are the 14 dealers that are, you know, connected fully to each other, and then also connected to all the customers. So this is to say, if you look at this matrix and you look at this matrix, you know, these are pretty closely matching, especially, you know, you do get, you know, these far out customers with the fewest connections might not be connected to all 14, but they're connected to several, and they don't trade very much. So if you really only looked, you know, here to here, everybody's, you know, looking very much like this core periphery network. This is the aggregate credit risk factor. It's an equally weighted average of all the 5-year single name US CDS. We're looking at this period here, so sort of normal times. You can see that the average spread is given here. It's going to be about, I think it's like 140 something basis points, and that's a bit lower than, you know, the aggregate index. It's more tilted towards investment grade, and even the better credits in investment grade. And that's because these are single name prices, and so you got kind of larger firms there. So we're going to measure the aggregate exposure of each contract to aggregate credit risk with this beta. That's a reference entity and time specific. Then we'll aggregate that. We'll get ZI, the notional exposure to the aggregate credit risk factor per dollar of equity for each institution in the dealer sector. ZI greater than 0 means that the I is a net seller, meaning that they're taking on credit risk exposure when they trade in the CDS market, and ZI reflects all of I's positions, so it's akin to a portfolio beta. And this is really a key empirical finding. It is that the net position in the CDS market, you know, it's very heterogeneous. You have a lot of institutions that are, you know, kind of net zero in their CDS trading. Then you have some that are demanding, you know, a fair amount of insurance. But then really importantly, you have a smaller-ish number of institutions that are very large net sellers. These are dealers only. So within those 14 dealers, you know, these dealers are really key to the fact that the dealer sector has a higher risk-bearing capacity and is an insurance provider to the rest of the market. Some dealers add capacity, some remove it, and a few dealers are large net sellers. So when we remove a dealer, the results are really going to depend on, do we take a net neutral dealer? Do we take one of these big net sellers? Or do we take someone who's actually you know, removing risk-bearing capacity by being a net buyer of credit insurance? The results are going to be starkly different. So one of the key things we need is price.
Sorry, Andrea.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's going to be a bit of inside baseball between you and I, but we had, in our work earlier, we had this notion of size that was a shifter of risk-bearing capacity as well. Yeah. How?
Yeah,
we take into account to measure exposure? Or?
We do. This is, it's per dollar of equity. So it takes into account dealer size. So if a very large dealer has a very large, you know, is a very large net seller, and a small dealer is kind of a large net seller relative to their size, those two could be the same. Okay. All right, so we're back to price dispersion. So this is the difference in prices between dealers and customers. And I'm seeing that I have kind of like, I guess probably 11 or 12 minutes to get through the rest of the material. So let me just say that we have a few different ways of measuring the difference between the average spread that dealers trade with each other and the average spreads that customers trade with dealers. If you know, if you want to use a spread that kind of eliminates these price impactors effects that we've been discussing kind of early on, then you can use this high competition spread, which is kind of a little bit over 5 basis points. And that is where you have a very large customer that's doing those trades. So you're only comparing dealer trades with dealer trades with sort of very active large customers. So we call that the high competition dealer customer spread. Okay, so we've got this core periphery trading network. We've got our dealers' net positions. Dealers are net sellers of credit protection on average. A handful of dealers provide the bulk of credit insurance. Interdealer prices are lower than dealer customer prices. This is useful because we're going to feed those facts into our model. We're going to identify our structural parameters, and we're going to do some counterfactuals. Okay, so let's get into that estimation. I think we're on, this, we should have the perfect amount of time. Okay, so we are going to use this dealer customer spread of about 5.12 basis points. That's on an average dealer spread of 133 basis points. We have a Walrasian spread implied by just the fundamentals without network frictions that would be about 10 basis points higher at 143 basis points. And along with this important OTC intermediary moment, this ZD bar is the net position of the dealer sector, the equity weighted net position of the dealer sector. And the fact that that is positive 0.045 means that the dealer sector, some of them are net neutral, but on average, they are providing insurance to the entire market. With those moments, we are going to get, just from a direct mapping, our 2 key parameters, alpha, the level of risk aversion. I should say we're also using some fundamental things about loss given default and probability of default as is standard in credit pricing. But we're going to get a risk aversion, and then we're going to get this parameter phi, which is 8. What does 8 mean? That means that there is a 0.04 basis point trading cost on average in dealer trade. So this is a very small average trading cost when you're talking about dealer trades. So that's this average cost of holding concentrated positions or large bilateral positions of 0.04 basis points per trade. Okay, any questions so far? I guess I can take like one question and then I'll. Okay, so let me tell you what happens then with our calibrated model. Level and dispersion of spreads. All spreads are lower than the Walrasian or complete network. Why? Because of the compensation for taking on large bilateral positions. The average dealer spread is lower than the average dealer customer spread because the dealer sector risk-bearing capacity is higher than that of the customer. And that's something we infer from the Z, from the fact that the dealer sector is a net provider of credit insurance in the data. So here's the complete network spread at 143 basis points. And then this is the 133 basis point spread of dealer. And then the customer is 3.5% lower and lies in the middle relative to the complete network spread. Okay, so let's get to those systemic risk implications. What we're going to do is we're going to remove some key dealers with different roles in the dealer, in the intermediary, the dealer sector of our OTC market. So it seems natural to define a systemically important dealer as one whose failure has a large impact on prices. Our model lets us simulate dealer failure one by one in the data. And we're going to have this simple approach. We're going to remove a dealer J from the network along with their risk-bearing capacity, and then we're going to resolve for equilibrium prices and quantities. So it's going to be important to note that when we remove a dealer, say we remove the largest net seller of protection, it's not going to be that just the loss of that dealer's risk-bearing capacity can move prices. We will show that in the complete network case, actually, there's basically no effect on prices of removing that dealer. It's only in this network frictions framework that removing this largest net seller has this 20% increase in credit spreads. Okay, so here's that baseline calibration where we have the complete network in gray, customer dealer spreads in yellow, and dealer dealer spreads in blue. And then if we remove the largest net seller dealer, so picture that Z distribution, and the one that was on the right kind of around positive 0.2, someone in that range, if the network is complete, there's almost no effect on spreads. So removing that dealer's risk-bearing capacity doesn't move prices when the network is complete. If the network is incomplete and calibrated to the data that we observe, then customer spreads are going to increase by over 15 basis points. So that's on the 133 basis point average spread. So that's an increase of 11%. And dealer spreads are going to actually increase by more, by 31 basis points or 23%. And the other key thing in this picture is the ordering changes. We had this ordering in normal times of dealer-dealer spreads being the lowest, customer-dealer spreads being in the middle, and complete network spreads being the highest. When we remove the largest net selling dealer, that actually changes the dealer sector from being a net provider of insurance to being a net demander of insurance. And that changes the order of spreads, and that's one of the reasons that you see this very large increase in the size of the spreads. And that is this dealer-dealer spread, which is what market measures, right? They are taking spreads in the dealer-dealer trades. That increases by 23% just by removing this large dealer in the incomplete network and resolving the model. We can also—
Hi, Andrea, a quick question.
Yes.
Have you thought about removing the dealer with higher some sort of centrality measure, or just the size matters? Because I wonder to what extent the topology of the network plays a role here.
Yeah, and we could do that. We can do that numerically by, for us in this core baseline, core periphery baseline, all dealers are equally central in terms of their number of connections, but they're not equally central in terms of their role, in terms of their sort of risk-bearing capacity just in the CDS market alone. We could use the empirical G matrix to remove a dealer, a less connected dealer versus a more connected dealer. Our 14 dealers, though, they are connected to most of the top traders, but we can definitely do that. Okay, so let me, yeah.
So
I'm sorry. Oh, I have 2 minutes, but please do feel free if the organizers will let me answer and still.
As many minutes as you like. We also took 2 minutes from you at the beginning.
Okay, sure. Yeah, please ask your question then. That's more fun.
all right, thanks. So is it true that the largest net seller is the institution who would have the biggest price differential once removed? I mean, those are two separate things, right? Maybe there will be another institution whose removal would have a larger impact. There'll be some kind of a result there that.
So right, in our model, the way it's specified with the, everything is sort of similar except the initial endowments. The biggest net seller is the one that will move prices the most, since all the dealers are connected equally and they have the same fee. If you want to give the dealers, in addition, another form of heterogeneity, if the heterogeneity comes from risk aversion, I believe that we'll get the same result, because essentially the one that is the least risk averse, kind of has the lowest combination of risk aversion and initial exposures. That one will be the one, when you remove them, they'll have the biggest effect on prices. Now, if you had a dealer that somehow, say, had the best credit rating. This is like the only AAA institution out there. And so when anyone went to, buy protection from them, even though they didn't, they for some reason didn't do a lot of it. Of course, in equilibrium, I think they would end up doing a lot of it. That person could have a large effect too. So if there was like somehow a very low fee institution, but I think what you would see is that institution actually would sort of be the largest net seller, because you'd get some combination of your fee, your alpha, your initial exposure determining, your role. Yeah. Okay, so let me just quickly say that if you remove the median seller, meaning someone who's kind of a true intermediary, meaning they're buying and selling in equal amounts relative to their equity, then you're going to get prices that are very similar to the baseline case. So there's kind of no difference here. It really you don't get a big effect from that median seller. And I don't think I'm going to have time to show it, but if you remove someone who's actually kind of sucking risk-bearing capacity out of the dealer sector because they're a dealer, but they demand insurance, then you can actually have that, removing them will lower prices. So last couple of things I'm going to say is, we talked about the fact that fee and alpha may change when there is dealer exit. When dealer exit's probably going to come at a time, could be driven actually by the realization of the aggregate credit risk factor. So which dealer will leave, should be made endogenous. If there are any grad students in the house, please, we would love for people to explore these extensions. But also fee and alpha might increase. So this is the no dealer exit core periphery model, where we're increasing risk aversion along this axis and increasing fee along this axis. So when you increase fee or alpha, you do get higher spreads. And we know that when you have the largest net seller exit, you also get higher spreads. So that's just this point moving up from down here. But there is this interaction between risk aversion going up and fee going up and taking the largest net selling dealer out. So, we're looking into things that can actually attenuate this 23% increase in credit spreads, but it's kind of pretty easy in this model to get those to be larger if you allow for risk aversion or aversion to large bilateral exposures to increase when a dealer exits. And I want to emphasize that those effects are not from removing that dealer and that dealer's risk-bearing capacity. The network frictions, as I'm sure you guys can all get on board with, are really key to those effects. This is spreads in a complete network model. There's no variation there with fee, but you get higher spreads when risk aversion increases. When you have dealer exit, in that case, these points essentially just, kind of map one to one. There's just not a big effect of removing the risk-bearing capacity if the network is complete and we can really all, contribute our risk-bearing capacity to risk sharing. Okay, so on that note, let me conclude. This is a first static step towards a tractable quantitative framework for intermediary asset pricing in OTC markets. We're really building on this exciting literature in OTC financial markets and trying to connect that to this exciting and empirically successful intermediary asset pricing literature, and bring in some ideas from the systemic risk literature to that literature. We're building on some great work by people in this virtual room on OTC financial markets. Network frictions yield price dispersion. They change the price level. They provide a key role for core dealers' financial soundness. And we saw from the work by Haddad and Muir that the most intermediated asset markets, and they measure intermediation by participation, trading costs, exposures from value at risk measures, those highly intermediated markets are OTC markets. So we want to make these important connections between those network models, intermediary asset pricing, and systemic risk. Our key results in terms of connecting these literatures are just that the sector level intermediary risk-bearing capacity is key, but there are differences from the OTC intermediary model too. There's a countable number of dealers, so single dealer health can matter, as in the job market paper of Emil Siriwardane. Heterogeneity means that risk-bearing capacity may not be an equity-weighted average. In our model, it isn't, because it depends on initial endowments as well. Some dealers can contribute disproportionately to the aggregate, and some dealers can actually reduce intermediary risk-bearing capacity. So with that, I will open it up to questions, and hopefully some co-authors are here too to have a conversation with you guys. Thanks for all the questions as we were going along.
Thank you so much, Andrea. So everybody, please ask your questions. And also, if you're registered as an attendee, don't forget you can use the raise hand feature, and we will call on you to ask your question to Andrea as well. Thank you.
I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can see, oh, the chat and everything.
Andrea, we have a question in the Q&A. Maybe you'd like to answer it?
Oh, sure. Sorry if I missed this, but how do you estimate pre-trade exposures? Thanks. Yes, so the model actually gives us a closed form mapping between the net trades in the CDS market and those initial exposures. So there's a direct mapping between the, given the alpha, the phi, the G, there's a direct mapping between the Z's, which is the net trade in the CDS market, and the initial exposure omega I.
I have a question. So you have you showed us a lot of pictures about spread. I was wondering if you have a corresponding picture for welfare or the quality of risk sharing in networks before and after removal of dealers.
We don't. I need someone brave like you to talk about welfare. We could think about something like that. I don't know, Bernard, do you want to chime in there? We've definitely looked at, so one of the things we've looked at is, because I think connected to sort of our motivation is, how good is the risk sharing within the dealer sector? Meaning how heterogeneous are these dealers actually? And kind of what gives them the different roles, and then what are the effects of these different roles? It's sort of, it is also because we don't have, like in our paper, we had endogenous entry and exit. So thinking about welfare, I think, maybe isn't as heroic as where we're taking some of those things as given. So I view this paper really as not a normative exercise at all, but very much a positive exercise about taking these OTC network pricing models and matching them as close as we can to the data, and trying to link them to this bigger literature in asset pricing, because we've moved out of just, staring at the cross section of equity returns, and we're looking a lot more at these other asset classes. And all of you guys have made, super important contributions to how, for lack of a better word, the microstructure of those markets does affect the pricing. And so, I think for that, we need these, we need to take into the positive effects of the network structure and the different roles of intermediaries, in thinking about certainly those pricing during normal times. And I should say now there are all these papers on, bases, trade bases, like covered interest rate parity going out, and Francis's work on asset mispricing, where two assets have similar credit risk but have different prices at certain times. Francis specifically connects that to different inventories by different dealers, and different dealers pricing based on their inventory and the I think that the work on OTC markets can really be used to understand in an even clearer way how we get these market dislocations. And of course, Daryl and many others have done important work on making those connections, but we can make it, with the newly available microdata, even more, tightly connected. Yeah. So Pierre, what question would you ask? You know, so welfare, you know, risk sharing, there is a loss of risk sharing, and the fact that prices are, you know, higher, we know that there's going to be a loss, and there's already worse risk sharing vis-a-vis the complete network.
Yeah, so I meant, you know, I know there are general equilibrium questions that are, you know, not within reach of model of that sort, but I think there are measures of welfare that are meaningful even from a partial equilibrium perspective, to know, you know, how much of the gains from trade are being attained. And you can see, you know, I mean, I guess mechanically when dealers come out, you know, some of the gains from trade are reduced, but are not, because the risk-bearing capacity of that dealer is out. But then, you know, the friction themselves might increase in some way, which means that even in that smaller population, a larger fraction of the gains from trade might not be realized or something like that.
Yeah, or even if the distributional consequences, as you said, if it's like, you know, the consequences are borne more, you know, either by the central dealers, which could be bad for future financial soundness of the dealer sector, or by customers, which would mean, you know, these smaller institutions, less well connected, have lost more.
Some things along those lines. Just, I mean, the spread is telling you something about distribution, I guess, already.
Yep.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Pierre. Yeah.
So it is really interesting that removing a dealer has a small effect when the network is complete, but that number is 20% in the OTC market. Might you be able to calibrate how the degree of incompleteness affects that number?
Yeah. Yeah, we certainly can't. I mean, we can certainly look at that dealer removal exercise for just different levels of fee.
But as you're starting from a complete network.
Yeah, and so I guess we have sort of the average spread will equal the complete network spread when fee is 0. So I was thinking we can move away from, you know, that complete network benchmark spread by just taking fee from 0 to the calibrated value.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, because the other thing to vary, we have these two frictions, the connections and the fee. So we can also, and actually fee gives us a way of having, in a way, and it's counterparty specific, but it gives us a way of varying, you know, kind of like the availability of the intensity of a particular connection. But yeah, we have the two levers, the G and the fee. So I'd have to think about how the G comparative static would work. Maybe allowing some of the customers to have some additional connections, but the fee one is clear, and we should definitely do that.
That would be really interesting. I would love to see how sensitive that number is. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Can you also do that, like thinking of how the heterogeneity of dealers affect that removal of the biggest dealer? So how the dispersion of the dealers?
Yes. So I definitely, you know, thank you so much for having me in this and having our paper in this session, because it really, you know, it was such a great chance to think about all these things. But you know, that Z distribution has this particular form where it's skewed and there's some really big net sellers. And I think that distribution, you know, comparative statics around that distribution are very interesting comparative static to do, because you know, you can look at, you know, more symmetry, wider spread. It does seem, and you know, at least hasn't been refuted by people who've looked at other markets, you know, that there are you know, 14 to 20 dealers that are pretty easy to contact and very connected in the sense that they're doing, you know, some trades with many people in that market, but that, you know, and kind of as we saw with the failure of Lehman, you know, just some players that seem to be big providers of insurance and play this, you know, different role than just being very well connected. You know, they're actually, because of their initial exposure, because of their risk aversion, willing to provide a lot more insurance in equilibrium, and then, you know, playing this outsized role. yeah, we will definitely look into that. Daryl, hi.
Hi, how are you?
Oh. Good, how are you? Good to see some blue sky there.
Yeah, I'm outside.
Awesome.
I have a question about the experiment that compares the complete network to the dealer intermediated network, the core periphery. So the idea is, which is a bit counterintuitive, but now I understand it. When you go from complete to core periphery, the average cost of insurance goes down, which you might not have expected with sort of a first welfare theorem kind of risk sharing kind of intuition. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering about the philosophy of including all the interdealer trades in that calculation of the average risk premium. The way I think about it is the core is kind of a machine that replaces an exchange. So if you swap out the whole core with an exchange, you wouldn't count all the interdealer trades. I mean, I wouldn't count them all in the average cost of buying protection. So for another example, oh, there's a truck near me. I don't know if you can hear it. Let's take another example. Suppose it's not core periphery, but rather we replace the core with a circle of dealers. Sorry, there's a truck going right by me.
We can hear you.
Okay, so we have this circle of dealers now. So we're on Mars. It's a different experiment. We're taking out a completely connected core with a circle of dealers, and I trade with, I'm a customer of you, and then now you have to get the trade through this circle of dealers to the ultimate seller of protection. And so it goes around and around the circle. Let's say there's 100 dealers on Mars, and every one of them counts for one trade, and they're all giving each other kind of a mid-market type of pricing because it's a efficient bilateral exchange. And then out comes the other end to Pierre Olivier, who ultimately sells protection at a very high price because the market's so inefficient. So my trade to you and Pierre Olivier's trade are really the only ones that matter if you think of the core as a machine that replaces the exchange. But the other 99 trades in the circle are getting equally weighted, and it looks like the average market performance has improved with respect to the risk premium. So again, I'm just going to not the accuracy of the result, which sounds right, I get the intuition, but rather the philosophy behind the experiment of including all the interdealer trades.
Okay, so very good question. And, I think a lot to think about with a different sort of interdealer market in some sense, with the fee that's actually fairly small, this 0.04 basis point average, trading cost when I'm trading with other dealers, and the fact that I'm connected to all other dealers is kind of, we're doing pretty well actually in the dealer sector. So let me just say that if we look only at customer dealer trades, oh wait, I wanted to share my screen again. I guess I don't really need to do screen share, but just to say that the customer dealer spreads, can you guys see that?
Yep.
Yeah, the customer dealer spreads are also lower than the Walrasian or complete network spreads. And that again is because of the worse risk sharing and the fact that the spreads, whenever I trade with someone, need to include this cost of concentrated exposures. So that's, we will, not as much lower relative to the complete network as the dealer, but still 3.5% lower. So we have this ranking that is in normal times when the dealer sector is a net seller, highest spreads in the complete network, followed by the customer, followed by the dealer. And I want to point everyone to, because, I sort of, had worked in capital reallocation and then had worked in OTC markets, to the work by Javatsa in the aircraft market. And his econometrica paper, has the same theoretical results and the same empirical result in that dealer market. But like I said, kind of when I first spoke about this, in a way, when we saw this, I thought, oh, darn, because the credit spread puzzle is that spreads are too high relative to fundamentals, not that they're too low. But the fact that this ordering actually switches when you take out a dealer, and you kind of get this actual, if dealers fail in bad times, you get that in bad times, actually, the spreads are higher than the while raising. So you get the increase in spread and the change in the ordering. But yeah, we've been thinking deeply about kind of the intuition for this comparison to the level of Walrasian.
That's very helpful. Another experiment might be to not compare just the customer to dealer trades. I guess in your complete network, the dealers are participating as though as same as everybody else, right?
Yeah, complete network is a ones matrix. Ones matrix.
Yeah, so another experiment might be to say, well, the dealers are there mainly to provide intermediation in an OTC market. So if we were to compare an OTC market with an exchange market, maybe we wouldn't have dealers to the same extent. They would still, maybe there would be a smaller number or less risk-bearing capacity because they don't need to intermediate all the trades.
Yeah, and so, right. I mean, I would, in this kind of, where we have multiple places to trade, I would say, I would go back to the Malamed Rostek paper and use their intuition to think about what would go on there. Yeah. So here it really is, there's a CDS market. It is its own, Mars, and that's where we have to trade this credit risks, single market with this structure. And now if we also have some other places, actually our Mayar Kargar, who wanted to be here, he was our student now at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, works on intermediate asset pricing, also has worked with Pierre on some bond pricing kind of exercises during COVID. He has looked at a version of this model that I presented today with, to think about the CDS bond basis, where you might have a different network structure in the corporate bond market than you do in the CDS market. And kind of as you probably will intuit, like a small amount of connectivity between those two markets makes it sort of hard to get a basis. But if you have different cores in those two markets, so some that are dealers in one market and not in the other, then you can get a difference, a basis that's driven just by the different network structures. Sort of, sorry, a little probably unrelated to your original question. So we'll definitely think about those alternative experiences. So we have a lot of experiments to think about, in the revision, and we're learning something new from everyone. So I just have to say thank you for everyone for thinking about it with us.
Andrea, do we have time for one more question?
We have time. Does Andrea have time?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I blocked. I blocked a fair amount of time for this. This is very important. Yeah.
I don't want to move too much out of the model, but let's for a minute think of a situation where, there is some way in which these institutions could default. There could be contagion over network of discrete defaults, right? Not just price contagion. And suppose we remove one large institution from the core, that could have led to some of the peripheral ones to default, necessitating their removal. And that could go back to the core, remove some from the core, and back and forth. And depending on the rounds of contagion, the reversal might get reversed again, that might get reversed again. So I think it may be a little bit important for this intuition to perhaps think about a little bit more generalized version of systemic risk instead of just like a counterfactual where, what if we didn't have this institution?
Yeah, it's definitely a goal of ours. I don't know whether we'll be able to achieve it in this paper because we need some, endogenous participation decision to be able to think about, exit or even default. But you know, we can do a cheap version where we, you know, we think about the ones who in a crisis would be most likely to leave would be the ones, you know, with the most exposure to the aggregate credit risk factor or something like that. But certainly we've been, you know, thinking about how to extend to do more in all the directions of all the three literatures we're connecting to. So there are many interesting extensions going deeper into, you know, phenomenon in OTC markets like price impact that we talked about. There's dynamics that the intermediary asset pricing literature has, and then in the systemic risk literature, there are these default chains that would be super interesting too. So yeah, we'll try. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you all the panelists and everybody who was asking questions. So with that, I think we'll call it into the formal part of the seminar and end the recording. But please, you're all invited to stick around. We don't need to end in the Zoom just yet. So please stick around and keep talking as long as you like. But with this, I'll end the recording, and thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.